12 years had passed since Serena vanished into the Nevada desert, her disappearance a whisper of fear that haunted families and headlines alike. The desert, vast and unforgiving, held its secrets tightly, until a hiker stumbled upon a buried shack, and with it, the chilling truth no one dared imagine. Serena's story was far from simple, a tale of abduction, unimaginable torture, and a memory stolen by cruelty. Now, the shadows of the past were clawing back into the present, demanding answers. Who had taken her, and why? The desert was about to reveal a darkness that would shock everyone, and only Serena could survive it. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the blazing summer sun, a vast expanse of golden sand, jagged rocks, and whispering winds that carried an eerie sense of both freedom and danger. Serena Sanders, 32, had never been to the desert before, and though she was excited, there was an undercurrent of nervous anticipation in her chest. She had always been adventurous, but this trip, planned with her family, a few cousins, and some common friends, was unlike any other she had undertaken. Her parents had suggested a short excursion near the outskirts of the town, promising breathtaking views, easy hiking paths, and the thrill of desert exploration without real danger. Serena, curious and eager to prove her independence, had insisted on joining the group, determined to experience the wilderness firsthand. The morning of the trip was filled with laughter and chatter as the family convoy of SUVs wound its way along the cracked and sun-baked desert roads. Serena and her cousins took turns pointing out unique rock formations, spotting distant wildlife, and joking about the desert as if it were some magical, endless playground. Friends carried cameras, snapping photographs of wildflowers clinging stubbornly to life among the rocks and of sand dunes that seemed to roll forever. Serena wandered slightly ahead of the group, fascinated by a small canyon that cut sharply into the sand and offered the faintest hint of shadow from the harsh sun. She didn't think she was far. After all, the group had agreed to stay close, and the desert seemed safe enough. But then, in a brief moment that would unravel everything, Serena slipped quietly off the path to explore a cluster of strange, weathered boulders. A dry wind whipped around her, and when she turned to call back to her cousins, they were already out of sight behind a ridge. Her voice carried, but the echoes returned faintly, distorted and lost, swallowed by the desert's expanse. Serena's heart beat faster, but she reminded herself that she could handle this. She had grown up with a sense of independence, with a stubborn confidence that sometimes teetered on recklessness. She bent to examine a rock formation that resembled a miniature cave, fascinated by its shadowed interior, when she heard a low, distant hum of an engine. Thinking it was one of the SUVs, she waved toward the horizon, expecting a familiar face to emerge, but no one appeared. Minutes turned to an hour. Serena's curiosity began to waver, replaced by unease. She called out repeatedly, but only the wind responded, carrying her voice in broken fragments across the dunes. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying, turning every movement into effort. Serena retraced her steps, scanning the familiar rocks and dunes, but the desert had shifted. Each rock, each dune seemed slightly different, as if the landscape itself had conspired to hide her from view. Panic, sharp and immediate, settled in her chest. Serena realized she had become disoriented, the thin trail she had followed erased by the endless golden sand. Her water bottle rattled uselessly in her backpack, a small, futile comfort against the vast and silent desert. Meanwhile, her cousins returned from a short detour, laughing and unaware of her absence. When they noticed she was missing, their smiles faded, replaced by anxious calls that echoed through the still air. The group retraced their steps, shouting her name, scanning every shadow, every ridge, and every hollow. Hours passed with no sign of Serena, and the laughter that had filled the morning gave way to tension, fear, and despair. The family contacted local authorities, who arrived with trained search teams, drones, and tracking dogs, combing the desert relentlessly. The heat of the afternoon sun burned down mercilessly as days passed, leaving the group exhausted and increasingly hopeless. The only clue that emerged was a small, partially buried scarf caught on a jagged rock near the miniature cave Serena had been inspecting. Nothing else, no footprints, no signs of struggle, suggested where she had gone or what had happened. The desert, vast and unforgiving, swallowed her entirely, leaving her family with nothing but uncertainty and fear. As night fell on the first day, the desert became silent, the sky a canopy of stars so brilliant it seemed to mock the helplessness below. Serena's disappearance marked the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across years, leaving questions unanswered, hearts aching, and a shadow lingering over the desert that no sun could dissipate. What no one knew in those first desperate days of searching was that Serena had not simply vanished into the merciless desert. She had been watched, carefully, silently, by a man whose presence had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Victor Crane was a drifter with a twisted fascination for control and secrecy, a man who had lived on the margins of small towns across the Southwest, leaving behind a trail of suspicion and whispers but never enough evidence to convict him. On that fateful day, as Serena wandered near the miniature cave, he had appeared seemingly from nowhere, a shadow merging with the jagged rocks. His calm demeanor belied the violence lurking beneath. In moments he had restrained her, muffled her protests, and forced her into the back of his old, dust-caked truck, driving her far from the paths that anyone dared search. To the outside world, Serena's disappearance seemed a tragic accident, but in reality, it had been meticulously orchestrated. Victor's hideout was an abandoned shack, hidden deep in a remote canyon miles from the desert road. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, but Victor had converted it into a grim sanctuary where Serena would be trapped, cut off from everything familiar. She remembered nothing of the drive. The trauma and shock had fractured her memory even before she arrived. When she awoke, the world was a blur of muted colors and jagged shapes, the desert light filtering through cracks in the walls. Her captor was meticulous in isolation, leaving her with no clue of the outside, no sense of time. Days merged into nights, weeks into months, each moment punctuated by Victor's interrogations, manipulations, and the creeping dread of a life stolen entirely. Serena struggled to recall who she was, what had happened, or even what day it was. Her mind, battered by fear and deprivation, built walls around the memories, locking them away in the only way it knew how, by erasing them. Victor was both terrifyingly cruel and strangely methodical. He monitored her movements, controlled her access to food and water, and even forced her to write and destroy journals, mocking her attempts to remember. Serena's world became a haze of survival, the desert beyond the shack reduced to a distant memory she could not fully summon. Yet, despite the terror, fragments of her spirit resisted. In moments of silence, she remembered sunlight on her hair, laughter with cousins, and the faint scent of sagebrush carried by the desert wind. These fleeting memories gave her the resolve to endure, even as Victor's manipulations and occasional bursts of violence threatened to crush her entirely. Years passed in this isolated nightmare. The world outside moved on without her. Missing person posters faded, social media updates dwindled, and her family's hope grew dim but never fully disappeared. Victor's pattern was simple. He remained hidden, his crimes unnoticed, feeding on anonymity and control. He had built a life around the shadows, using fear to suppress Serena's resistance. Yet the desert, which had once seemed limitless and threatening, had in some cruel way preserved her, keeping her alive in the harsh isolation. Her body aged, her mind adapted, and though she could no longer recall the events of her disappearance clearly, a deep instinct for self-preservation burned within her. The first cracks in Victor's control came unexpectedly. A hiker, exploring trails far from the usual paths, stumbled upon remnants of the old shack. The sight of a door long forgotten, partially buried by sand, triggered a sequence of events that Victor had never anticipated. Serena, locked in a world of fragmented memory, could not yet understand the significance, but her instincts screamed danger and opportunity all at once. She hid, observed, and waited, every fiber of her being attuned to the faintest sound or movement. Meanwhile, Victor, unaware that his carefully constructed prison had been discovered, continued his routine, blind to the approaching collapse of the years he had built around fear and secrecy. The desert, patient and silent, was about to reveal its long-held secret. By the time rescue teams reached the area, Serena's memories were scattered shards, barely recognizable to herself. She was physically intact but psychologically fractured, her identity locked behind layers of trauma. The discovery of her near-skeletal body buried in the shack's hidden corner revealed more than her survival. It exposed the grotesque truth of Victor Crane's crimes and the horrific duration of Serena's captivity. The desert, which had swallowed her so completely, had also preserved the evidence of foul play, setting the stage for a confrontation with a past she barely remembered and a future she had not dared imagine. The morning the hiker stumbled upon the long-forgotten shack, the desert seemed almost to hold its breath, as if it had waited 12 years for this moment. To anyone else, it would have appeared as nothing more than a dilapidated ruin, half swallowed by sand and time, a relic of some forgotten past. But when the hiker saw the faint outline of the door and noticed the odd depressions in the sand nearby, an uneasy feeling pricked at his instincts. He called authorities, and soon a team of search and rescue personnel arrived, combing the area carefully, their movements precise yet tentative, as if aware that what lay inside might not be a simple accident. When they pried open the hidden door, the smell hit them first, a sickly mixture of decay and dust. And then they found her. Serena, disoriented, skeletal, yet astonishingly alive, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. At first, she could not comprehend what was happening. The flood of voices, uniforms, and radios overwhelmed her fractured senses. She could not yet remember Victor's face or the months and years she had lost. Her memory remained locked in fragments. But instinctively she knew she was no longer alone, that danger had receded for the first time in more than a decade. As she was gently lifted out of the shack, the reality of her ordeal began to settle in. Paramedics checked her over. Minor injuries, severe malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma were catalogued quickly, but Serena's greatest wounds were unseen, buried in her mind. She could not recall the exact sequence of events that had brought her here. Names, faces, moments, everything seemed to float just out of reach, tantalizing yet inaccessible. Yet beneath the confusion, a spark of recognition stirred when authorities mentioned Victor Crane. The name rang faintly in some corner of her mind, a shadow she could not fully place. As news crews descended, flashing cameras and microphones creating a chaos that mirrored the turmoil in her head, investigators began piecing together the grim puzzle. The shack was not just abandoned, it had been a calculated prison. They unearthed old tools, restraints, and signs of long-term captivity. The discovery made headlines almost immediately, the story gripping the nation with its shocking combination of survival and horror. Serena's family arrived hours later, faces etched with disbelief, hope, and grief. They had mourned her quietly for years, clinging to the slim possibility that she might still be alive, and now that hope was a fragile, trembling reality. Their reunion was tentative at first, punctuated by awkward pauses and tears, Serena unable to recall specific memories of them yet comforted by the undeniable warmth of familiarity. The emotional intensity of that first embrace was overwhelming. It was as if the years of absence had been compressed into a single moment of recognition and relief. Meanwhile, investigators intensified their focus on Victor Crane, combing records, tracing his movements, and piecing together evidence from the shack. The revelation of foul play, combined with the horrific state in which Serena had been found, painted a portrait of calculated cruelty and meticulous planning. Every shred of debris, every mark on the walls told a story of prolonged torment, isolation, and psychological manipulation. Over the next days, Serena underwent extensive medical evaluations and therapy, both physical and psychological. The professionals working with her were careful not to force memory recall too abruptly. They understood that too much pressure could shatter her fragile sense of self. Slowly, through patient conversations, guided therapy, and the presence of her family, fragments of her past began to return. She remembered flashes of Victor, his controlling demeanor, and the fear that had defined her daily existence. But the memories were often incomplete, fragmented, and horrifying in their implications. She began to understand the depth of what she had endured, not just the physical deprivation, but the psychological torment, the constant manipulation, and the deliberate erasure of her life. The investigation into Victor's crimes escalated rapidly once Serena provided the limited but critical details she could remember. Authorities located him in a distant town, living under a false identity, unsuspecting that the past he had tried to bury was closing in. His arrest was swift and unceremonious, a moment of vindication for the people who had waited 12 years for justice, yet it could not erase the suffering Serena had endured. As she sat with investigators, recounting the shards of memory she could muster, the reality of survival, of being found alive against impossible odds, settled over her. The desert had taken years from her, but it had not taken everything. Her spirit, fractured yet resilient, had endured. After Victor Crane's arrest, the world that Serena had once known began to collide with the present in ways she could neither predict nor fully control. Sitting in the sterile interrogation room, separated by a pane of glass from the man who had stolen 12 years of her life, she felt an unsettling mix of fear, anger, and detached curiosity. Victor's face, calm and unrepentant, seemed impossibly ordinary, yet the memories he had forced upon her body through pain and isolation flickered in her mind like broken film reels, shadows of screams, endless silence, and the suffocating walls of the shack. She struggled to reconcile the normality of his appearance with the monstrous reality of his actions, and as the investigators detailed the evidence they had gathered, pieces of her memory began to click into place. The tactics he had used, the manipulation, the calculated cruelty that had kept her compliant and terrified. At first, Serena could only sit in silence, letting the shock and rage settle into a cold, burning focus that sharpened her awareness. She realized that her recovery was not just physical, it was a confrontation with the man who had attempted to erase her existence. Over the following days, Serena began therapy sessions designed to reclaim both her identity and her autonomy. She worked with professionals to untangle the fragmented memories, to name what had happened, and to process the trauma without being consumed by it. Family members stayed close, offering support and love, but Serena knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a distant consideration. The primary goal was reclaiming her life. Public attention loomed, but she carefully navigated it, choosing to engage only in ways that strengthened her sense of control rather than eroded it. Slowly, she returned to simple routines, walking in the park, listening to music she remembered from before, revisiting photographs of her childhood, cousins, and friends. Each small act became a statement of resilience. She had survived, she was present, and she could continue. The confrontation with Victor in court months later crystallized this journey. She testified, her voice steady though heavy with emotion, describing the captivity, the torment, and the relentless fear she had endured. The courtroom hung on her every word, and the weight of years lost was palpable. Yet even as she relived parts of her trauma, she found a strange liberation in speaking the truth, in naming the man who had sought to annihilate her existence. The verdict was inevitable, the sentence severe, and while justice could not restore the years she had lost, it marked a turning point, a clear statement that the world recognized her suffering, that her story mattered, and that she would no longer be defined solely by the horror of what had been done to her. Months after Victor Crane's conviction, Serena began the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding a life that had been fractured beyond measure. The desert, once a place of terror and loss, became a symbol of her endurance rather than fear, and she returned to it cautiously, guided by friends and family who understood both her pain and her strength. She reconnected with her cousins and childhood friends, sharing laughter and stories she had once thought lost, and in doing so, she discovered that the world could still hold moments of joy, even after the darkest experiences. Therapy remained a cornerstone of her recovery, helping her navigate lingering trauma, nightmares, and the gaps in her memory, but over time, she noticed the subtle reclaiming of her identity, the confidence to make choices for herself, the ability to trust cautiously again, and the quiet pride in surviving what had once seemed insurmountable. Serena also became determined to help others, speaking anonymously to advocacy groups and survivors of abduction, using her story not as a spectacle but as a beacon of hope that recovery, though difficult, was possible. Small victories, a walk without fear, a visit to a crowded market, a shared meal with friends, reminded her that life could exist beyond trauma, and that she could define her own narrative. While scars remained, both visible and hidden, they became markers of resilience rather than shame. In the final moments, standing at the edge of the Nevada desert where she had first gone missing, Serena allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the wind across her face and the sun on her skin. The past could not be erased, but the present was hers, and the future, once stolen, was finally something she could claim. She had survived, she had faced her captor, and she had emerged not just alive, but whole enough to continue, stronger and wiser than she had ever been before.